So picture this. It's the year 70 AD, and the absolute center of the Jewish faith is just burning to ashes.
The Second Temple in Jerusalem.
Right. The Second Temple. And we have to remember, this wasn't just, a nice local building. It was the literal, physical mechanism for interacting with the divine.
Yeah, it's where the sacrifices happen.
Exactly. Where the priesthood operated, where the core tenets of the religion were anchored. And suddenly, millions of people are left staring at these ancient scrolls containing these strict, rigid laws that are now, well, they're physically impossible to practice.
Right, because the infrastructure's gone.
Yeah. So what do you do when the sacred hardware of your entire civilization suddenly becomes completely incompatible with reality?
I mean, you are forced to innovate or you disappear. There's really no middle ground.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking this incredibly revealing interview between Steve Reed and Rabbi Brian.
It's a fascinating conversation.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the goal today is to look at how their discussion completely dismantles what so many Westerners, assume about Judaism, the Bible, and really the concept of religion itself.
Because people tend to assume that ancient text-based religions are just these locked vaults of rigid rules, right? Like they're just photocopied generation after generation.
Yes, exactly. But to really understand this deep dive, to understand how a tradition survives a trauma like the destruction of the temple, you first have to drop the idea that Judaism is a single static thing.
Right. It's an ethnicity, it's a culture, a people, and a religion all tangled together.
Yeah, and Rabbi Brian points this out right at the start with this huge curveball. He points out that Moses, the guy universally synonymous with the ancient law.
The guy coming down the mountain with the stone tablets.
Right, that guy. He wasn't actually a Jew.
Yeah, that always shocks people. But the terminology just doesn't map to that era. Historically, Moses was an Israelite.
Okay, break that down for us.
So the Israelites were a collection of tribes. And the specific tribe of Judah, which, is where the word Judaism originates, that didn't rise to prominence until centuries later, around the time of King David.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the term itself really only solidifies after the northern kingdom falls, and Judah is all that's left. So calling Moses a Jew is historically like, I don't know, calling an ancient Roman centurion an Italian.
That is such a good analogy. You're projecting a modern geographical identity backward onto a time before it even existed.
Exactly.
So if the very definition of the people is that fluid, evolving over centuries from a confederation of tribes into this distinct group, it completely changes how they interact with their own ancient laws.
It has to, because after the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, the religious landscape just fractured.
Right. And early Christians who, let's remember, were still essentially a Jewish sect at this time, they found a massive workaround to the problem of these ancient laws.
The Jesus option.
Yeah, the Jesus option. They decided that Jesus freed them from having to literally follow the law entirely.
They pivoted. They moved to a faith-based, grace-based system. The burden of the literal law was just lifted off their shoulders.
But the broader Jewish community didn't do that.
Yeah.
They didn't take the Jesus option. They had to figure out how to follow the laws exactly as written.
Because they remained committed to the idea that the Torah was divine.
Yeah.
And, you can't just cross out divine words with a red pen because your political situation changed.
No, you definitely can't.
So they had to figure out how to navigate these ancient and, frankly, sometimes brutal Bronze Age laws while living in a world where those laws just didn't make sense anymore.
And Rabbi Brian brings up the most mind-bending example of this. It's the law in the Torah about the disobedient child.
Oh, yeah. The stoning law.
Right. The text literally says that if you have a chronically stubborn, rebellious child, the parents are supposed to take them outside the city gates and have them stoned to death.
Which is horrific. Any civilized society intuitively knows you can't execute children.
But the rabbis are staring at a text they believe is divine.
Right.
And it commands exactly that.
So they engage in this process of extreme, hyper-literal reinterpretation. And this gets codified centuries later in the Mishnah, around 200 AD, and the Talmud around 500 AD. The rabbis essentially sat down with the stoning law and parsed it word by agonizing word.
And they fixated on the word child, right?
Exactly. The law specifically says you must stone a disobedient child. Well, the rabbis point out that in Jewish jurisprudence, a child under the age of 13 is not legally responsible for their own actions.
Right. The parents hold the legal culpability.
Yes, but the Torah explicitly says to stone the child, not the parents. So if the kid is under 13, you literally cannot punish them because they lack legal culpability.
Okay, but what if they're older?
Well, once a person turns 13 under that same legal framework, they are recognized as an adult. They are legally no longer defined as a child.
Oh my gosh.
Right. And because the stoning law applies strictly and exclusively to a child,
A person over 13 can't be stoned either.
exactly. The legal conditions for the execution can never actually be met, whether they are 12 or 14.
So the law stays perfectly intact on the parchment. They didn't erase it. But the execution of the law is permanently nullified by a technicality.
A brilliant technicality.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because my mind is kind of blown. Is the Talmud basically just a massive terms of service patch update?
A patch update. I love that.
Like, think about it. The hardware, the Torah stays exactly the same, right? You can't change the hardware. But the rabbis write centuries of new code, new legal conditions, so the system doesn't crash when it tries to run in a modern, empathetic society.
That is a perfect way to look at it. It functions exactly like a patch update. Though, the rabbis wouldn't see it as overwriting the system. What's fascinating here is they saw themselves as unlocking the text's true, intended compassion through rigorous intellectual debate.
Wow.
It shifted the whole religion away from blind, terrifying obedience into this highly intellectual parsing of text. You see the exact same mechanic applied to the famous eye for an eye law.
Which, I mean, that always sounds incredibly barbaric to modern ears. Just gouging out eyes.
It does, but you have to look at the historical context of the ancient Near East. When eye for an eye first appeared, and we see this in Hammurabi's code around 1800 BCE, it was actually a wildly progressive limitation on violence.
Wait, really? Progressive?
Yeah, because prior to that, the cultural norm was just escalating blood feuds. If someone blinded your sheep, you might slaughter their entire family.
Oh, right. Total disproportionate revenge.
Exactly. So eye for an eye was this radical, almost liberal attempt to introduce strict proportionality to justice. It capped the retribution.
Okay, but still, strict physical proportionality is a logistical nightmare.
And the later rabbis realized this immediately.
Yeah.
So they applied their legal parsing to the text and asked all these practical questions like, what if the victim's vision is 20/20, but the perpetrator has terrible eyesight?
Right.
Are those eyes economically or biologically equal? What if a one-eyed man accidentally blinds a two-eyed man? If you take the perpetrator's only eye, he's completely blind, which is a disproportionate punishment.
Because no two eyes are perfectly equal.
Exactly. So a literal physical extraction is impossible to execute fairly.
So they reinterpret it to mean monetary compensation.
You got it. You assess the economic value of the lost eye, lost wages, medical costs, pain and suffering, and the perpetrator pays the equivalent value. The text eye for an eye never changes, but the interpretation evolves from physical mutilation to a civilized civil lawsuit.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
But, this constant evolution of interpretation, it assumes something very specific about the text itself.
What do you mean?
Well, the rabbis are creatively forcing these humane outcomes.
Yeah.
But the sources reveal that the text itself, long before the rabbis ever got their hands on it, it might have been written by multiple people who had very different views of who God even was.
Ah, yes. The textual tapestry. We should probably clarify some terminology before diving into that, though.
Good idea.
So in Judaism, these foundational texts are referred to as the Hebrew Bible, which is structurally similar to the Protestant Bible, but Jewish communities do not use the term Old Testament.
Right, because calling it the Old Testament inherently implies obsolescence. It suggests there's a newer, upgraded version that has rendered it irrelevant.
Exactly. It's a loaded theological term. Also, the word Torah itself is incredibly fluid. Narrowly, it means the first 5 books of Moses. Broadly, it can mean the entire Hebrew Bible or even the vast ocean of Jewish wisdom, including the Talmud.
Got it.
But when we look at those original 5 books, the interview brings up the documentary hypothesis. This is a theory that just revolutionized biblical scholarship in the 19th century.
Right, this is where scholars analyzing the original Hebrew started noticing these undeniable structural shifts in the writing.
Yeah, the grammar changes, the vocabulary shifts, but most tellingly, the actual name used for God changes depending on the passage you're reading.
This part is so fascinating to me.
It is. Scholars identified that when the text uses the name Elohim for God, the narrative generally depicts a cosmic, distant, but deeply loving and universally accepting deity. But when the text switches to using the name Adonai, the personality of the divine completely shifts. The tone becomes localized, it's stricter, more transactional, and highly focused on specific rules and punishments.
Which perfectly explains all those glaring inconsistencies you find in the early chapters of the Bible.
Right.
Like, take the creation story. Genesis chapter 1 has man and woman created simultaneously, right,
Yeah.
in the divine image by this booming cosmic
The
voice.
Elohim version.
Yes. Then you turn the page to Genesis chapter 2, and it's a completely different creation account. God is suddenly super hands-on, molding a man out of mud, putting him to sleep, extracting a rib to make a woman.
It's not one author changing his mind. It's a later editor weaving two distinct ancient traditions together.
The Noah's Ark story is even more tangled. I mean, we all grew up hearing the animals went in two by two.
Yeah, the classic Sunday school version.
Right. But if you read the actual text, it also commands Noah to bring 7 of each clean animal. And it even contradicts itself on the mechanics of the flood. Like, did the water fall as rain from the sky, or did it burst upward from the deep?
An editor clearly took two conflicting regional flood myths and spliced them together, verse by verse, into a single, highly imperfect narrative.
And the history of how these texts were officially gathered and canonized is steeped in this kind of synthesis. Our source mentions King Josiah.
Right, the religious reformer.
Yeah, he rules Judah centuries after Moses, and he initiates this massive campaign to clean out the temple and centralize worship. And during this renovation, his high priest miraculously finds a supposedly lost ancient scroll.
How convenient.
Right. And this scroll eventually becomes the book of Deuteronomy, which translates to a second telling. And it just so happens that this newly discovered scroll contains a revised, kinder interpretation of the ancient laws that perfectly aligns with King Josiah's immediate political reform agenda.
It's a very tidy narrative.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Isn't this just ancient political spin? I mean, it sounds exactly like Joseph Smith finding the golden plates in upstate New York thousands of years later.
Oh, that's a sharp comparison.
Right. It provides the exact divine revelations needed to launch his movement at the exact right time.
It is a compelling historical parallel, and scholars do heavily debate this. Was the Deuteronomy scroll genuinely discovered in some dusty archive, or was it strategically authored and planted by Josiah's allies to legitimize his reforms?
I mean, I know what I think.
Well, looking at the socio-political utility of it, the origin almost doesn't matter, because once it was absorbed into the culture, it became sacred. The broader takeaway here is that the Bible is not a single unified book dictated from the clouds.
Right.
It's a curated library. It is a compilation of different authors living in different eras, experiencing immense historical traumas, and attempting to explain God through their own unique political and cultural lenses.
And if the underlying text has multiple authors, and the laws have been debated, patched, and bypassed over thousands of years, well, then modern Judaism naturally isn't going to be a monolith either, right?
Oh, absolutely not. The spectrum of belief is staggering.
Because Christianity features incredible fragmentation. We're talking something approaching 45,000 different denominations globally.
Right. And Judaism's global population is tiny in comparison to that. But the internal diversity of thought is immense. It spans from the highly progressive reform and renewal movements on the left through conservative and modern Orthodox, all the way to the ultra-Orthodox groups on the far right.
The extremes of that spectrum are wild to me.
Mm-hmm.
On the far progressive left, you have humanistic Jews.
Yes.
They maintain congregations, they hold services, they celebrate the holidays, but they have entirely removed the word God from their prayer books.
Completely secularized.
Yeah, it is a secular, cultural, and ethnic practice of the religion.
Right.
And then you swing the pendulum all the way over to the far right to groups like the Lubavitchers.
Right, a major sect of Hasidic Judaism.
And these are the highly traditional communities you often see in places like Brooklyn, right?
Yes, but within the Lubavitch movement, there is a vocal faction that believes their deceased leader, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who died in 1994, was literally the long-awaited Messiah.
See, this Messiah complex weaves throughout Jewish history. The interview highlighted this fascinating figure from the 1600s named Shabbatai Tzvi.
Oh, Shabbatai Tzvi, what a story.
He managed to convince a massive portion of the Jewish world, roughly a third of the entire global Jewish population, at the time that he was the Messiah.
And to understand why he was so successful, you really have to look at the psychological state of the Jewish people at that time.
They were vulnerable.
Incredibly vulnerable. They had recently endured the horrific Finoniki massacres in Eastern Europe. The population was traumatized, displaced, and utterly desperate for a savior. Tyzigan capitalized on that desperation.
But he wasn't exactly stable, was he?
No. Modern historians reviewing his erratic behavior strongly suspect he suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Yeah. He would enter incredibly grandiose, manic states where he claimed to possess divine authority, and that would be followed by deep, debilitating depressions where he would isolate himself completely.
But during those manic phases, his charisma was apparently off the charts. I mean, he famously told his followers that he was so holy he could physically levitate above the ground.
Which is quite a claim.
Right. And when skeptics pointed out that his feet were visibly touching the dirt, his response was simply, "You aren't holy enough to witness the miracle."
Which is the ultimate conversational trump card, isn't it?
It really is. You can't argue with that.
No, but it reveals the terrifying power of mass delusion when a community is desperate for hope.
Okay, but this raises a major question for me about the boundaries of the religion.
Okay.
We've established that the Lubavitchers can believe their deceased rabbi is the Messiah, and humanistic Jews can delete God entirely from their liturgy, and both are still considered part of the Jewish tapestry.
Yes, they are.
But what about Messianic Jews? You know, the groups that believe Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah.
Ugh. This is where the theological elasticity finally snaps.
Tell me more.
Mainstream Jewish denominations universally reject Messianic Judaism as a valid form of Jewish practice, because the irreducible, absolute core of Jewish theology is the strict, indivisible oneness of God.
Oh.
Incorporating Jesus as a divine figure or as part of a Holy Trinity introduces an additional deity. It fundamentally violates the most basic parameter of the theology.
Wait. So humanistic Jews can subtract God and stay in the club, but Messianic Jews add a deity and get permanently exiled.
That's right.
Why does adding to the space-time continuum of the religion break the rules more than subtracting from it?
This raises an important question about how Judaism functions. Judaism is a culture of relentless questioning. The Talmud itself is basically a massive record of arguments.
Right, the patch updates.
Exactly. And it preserves the minority opinions. If a rabbi lost a theological debate in the 11th century, his losing argument is still meticulously recorded and studied just in case a future generation finds utility in his logic.
That's amazing.
So you are allowed to doubt God. You can wrestle with the text. You can prioritize cultural heritage over divine revelation. But the absolute indivisibility of God is the bedrock. The moment you divide God into parts or multiply God, you have stepped over the ultimate boundary line into a different religion entirely.
Okay, that makes sense. But if the theological boundaries are that strict about adding or dividing a deity, it makes me wonder how Judaism reconciles with the two concepts that entirely define its Western neighbor, Christianity.
We're talking about hell and Jesus.
Exactly, hell and Jesus.
It is easily the most common area of confusion. Rabbi Brian noted that out of all the complex theological questions he fields, the overwhelming majority are about the afterlife.
People want to know what happens next.
Constantly. What happens when we die?
And his answer is shockingly practical. He says, I'm trying to do this one lifetime at a time.
Right. When a person dies, the community gathers, they mourn the loss, and that is essentially the end of the focus.
Because the concept of an eternal burning hellfire of torment simply did not exist in the ancient Israelite worldview.
Not at all. Abraham had no concept of hell. Moses never preached about eternal damnation. If you scour the ancient texts, the closest glimpse of an afterlife is a story where King Saul sneaks away to consult the witches of Endor to conjure the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel.
And when Samuel's spirit appears, he isn't coming up from a lake of fire.
No, he's conjured from a place called Sheol.
Sheol.
Yeah, which is described as a murky, shadowy underworld. It's essentially a place of deep sleep for all the dead, regardless of how righteous or wicked they were. It is emphatically not a torture chamber of eternal fire and pitchforks. That specific imagery of hellfire was imported and developed centuries later.
So what does this all mean? If there's no hellfire to avoid and no salvation formula to memorize, is the Christian concept of hell basically just a scary DLC, like downloadable content added to the religion centuries later to keep people in line?
A scary DLC. I agree completely with that analogy. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it functions exactly like an expansion pack, but the underlying motivation is psychological certainty.
Because we're terrified of death.
Human beings are terrified of the unknown, and death is the ultimate unknown. It is deeply uncomfortable for the human psyche to sit with the answer, we don't know what happens next.
Yeah, we hate that.
So over the centuries, religious institutions constructed strict, vivid architectures of the afterlife and the end times to provide that missing certainty. But the tragic irony is that by becoming hyper-obsessed with the destination, believers often completely ignore the actual present-day mission of the original texts.
Which brings us to the Jewish perspective on Jesus. In Western culture, religion is heavily centered on his divinity.
But from the perspective outlined by Rabbi Brian, Jesus is viewed strictly as a historical figure,
Just a guy.
a very specific guy. He was a first-century Jewish teacher who was fiercely anti-authoritarian. He led a grassroots movement centered on radical love and compassion for the marginalized. And the rabbi speculated that if the historical Jesus were to return today, he would be utterly gobsmacked.
Gobsmacked. By what?
To see modern institutions using his name while heavily entrenching themselves in political power and government control, which is the exact establishment he fought against.
Wow. And, to clear up a major theological misconception that often poisons relations between these faiths, the rabbi specifically addressed the famous suffering servant passage in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53.
Yes. This is a critical point of divergence.
Break it down for us.
Well, in Christian theology, Isaiah 53 is almost universally read as a messianic prophecy. It's seen as predicting that Jesus would suffer and die for the sins of humanity.
Right.
But historically, a very dark anti-Semitic trope developed from this passage. Some theologians suggested that the Jewish people themselves were chosen by God to be the suffering servant. Yeah. That they were divinely destined to be tortured, exiled, and endure horrific violence like the Holocaust as a cosmic substitute, or perhaps as a punishment for failing to accept Jesus.
And the rabbi vehemently denounced that idea as horrific, right? I mean, to suggest any group of people is divinely mandated by God to suffer abuse is unthinkable.
It fundamentally violates the character of the divine as understood in Judaism. It strips away human agency and turns God into an abuser.
This entire deep dive really flips the script on how we view ancient traditions.
It really does.
I mean, we started with the assumption that ancient religion was a rigid, monolithic monument of stone tablets. And instead, we found ancient rabbis acting like desperate defense attorneys, utilizing brilliant legal technicalities just to avoid harming children.
Finding loopholes for compassion.
Exactly. We discovered that the Bible itself is a tapestry of multiple authors arguing with each other, seeing the divine through completely different historical lenses. We learned that you can have a functioning form of Judaism without God, but you can never, ever have it without debate.
It is a living ecosystem, not a museum exhibit. Rabbi Brian actually has a sign hanging in his office that beautifully synthesizes this entire approach.
What does it say?
It reads, number 1, kindness. Number 2, God.
Wow.
His philosophy is that religion is ultimately an experiment in human behavior. If you cannot get the kindness part right, if your theology doesn't produce empathy, then talking about God is completely pointless.
Number 1, kindness. Number 2, God. That is a massive paradigm shift.
And it leaves us with a profound final thought for you to ponder.
Let's hear it.
In our modern culture, we spend endless hours arguing over biblical literalism. We debate whether these ancient texts were perfectly and flawlessly dictated by a divine being. But consider how the ancient rabbis constantly bent, reinterpreted, and massaged the literal rules to force more compassionate, humane outcomes.
Right.
What if the ultimate proof of a text's divinity isn't its historical accuracy, but its capacity to evolve toward greater human empathy over thousands of years?
What if the text isn't a locked vault, but an invitation to an endless conversation? That is incredible. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it challenged your assumptions and gave you a new way to look at the history of these incredible traditions. Keep questioning the texts, keep looking for the loopholes of compassion, and, as always, keep diving deep.